Homage to Catalonia. By George Orwell. Homage to Catalonia is George Orwell's personal account of his experiences and observations fighting for the POUM militia of the Republican Army during the Spanish Civil War. The war was one of the defining events of his political outlook and a significant part of what led him to write in 1946. Every line of serious work that I have written since 1936 has been written, directly or indirectly, against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism, as I understand it. The first edition was published in the United Kingdom in 1938. The book was not published in the United States until February 1952, when it appeared with an influential preface by Lionel Trilling. Let's look chapter-wise summary of the work. Chapter 1. The book begins in late December 1936. Orwell describes the atmosphere in Barcelona as it appears to him. The anarchists were still in virtual control of Catalonia and the revolution was still in full swing. It was the first time that I had ever been in a town where the working class was in the saddle. Every wall was scrawled with the hammer and sickle. Every shop and cafe had an inscription saying that it had been collectivized. The anarchists, referring to the Spanish SNT and FI, were in control. Tipping was prohibited by workers themselves, and servile forms of speech, such as Senor or Don, were abandoned. He goes on to describe the scene at the Lenin barracks, formerly the Lepanto barracks, where militiamen were given what was comically called instruction, in preparation for fighting at the front. He describes the deficiencies of the POUM workers' militia, the absence of weapons. The recruits, mostly boys of 16 or 17, ignorant of the meaning of war. Half complains about the sometimes frustrating tendency of Spaniards to put things off until mañana, tomorrow. Notes his struggles with Spanish, or more usually, the local use of Catalan. He praises the generosity of the Catalan working class. Orwell leads to the next chapter by describing the conquering hero stuff. Parades through the streets and cheering crowds, that the militiaman experienced at the time he was sent to the Aragon front. Chapter 2. In January 1937, Orwell's Centuria arrives in Alcabier, just behind the line fronting Zaragoza. He sketches the squalor of the region's villages and the fascist deserters, indistinguishable from themselves. On the third day rifles are handed out. Orwell's was a German Mauser dated 1896. It was corroded and past praying for. The chapter ends on his Centuria's arrival at trenches near Zaragoza and the first time a bullet nearly hit him. To his dismay, instinct made him duck. Chapter 3. Orwell, in the hills around Zaragoza, describes the mingled boredom and discomfort of stationary warfare. The mundaneness of a situation in which each army had dug itself in and settled down on the hilltops it had won. He praises the Spanish militias for their relative social equality, for their holding of the front while the army was trained in the rear, and for the democratic revolutionary type of discipline, more reliable than might be expected. Revolutionary discipline depends on political consciousness, on an understanding of why orders must be obeyed. It takes time to diffuse this, but it also takes time to drill a man into an automaton on the barrack square. Throughout the chapter Orwell describes the various shortages and problems at the front. Firewood, we were between 2,000 and 3,000 feet above sea level. It was midwinter and the cold was unspeakable. Food, candles, tobacco, and adequate munitions, as well as the danger of accidents inherent in a badly trained and poorly armed group of soldiers. Chapter 4. After some 3 weeks at the front, Orwell and the other English militiamen in his unit, Williams, join a contingent of fellow Englishmen sent out by the Independent Labour Party to a position at Monte Oscuro, within sight of Zaragoza. Perhaps the best of the bunch was Bob Smiley, the grandson of the famous miners' leader, who afterwards died such an evil and meaningless death in Valencia. In this new position he witnesses the sometimes propagandistic shouting between the rebel and loyalist trenches and hears of the fall of Malaga. Every man in the militia believed that the loss of Malaga was due to treachery. It was the first talk I had heard of treachery or divided aims. It set up in my mind the first vague doubts about this war in which, hitherto, the rights and wrongs had seemed so beautifully simple. In February, he is sent with the other POUM militiamen 50 miles to make a part of the army besieging Huesca. He mentions the running joke phrase, "Tomorrow we'll have coffee in Huesca," attributed to a general commanding the government troops who, months earlier, made one of many failed assaults on the town. Chapter 5. Orwell complains, in Chapter 5, that on the eastern side of Huesca, where he was stationed, nothing ever seemed to happen, except the onslaught of spring. And, with it, lice. He was in a, so-called, hospital at Montflorite for 10 days at the end of March 1937. With a poisoned hand that had to be lanced and put in a sling. He describes rats that really were as big as cats, or nearly. He makes reference to the lack of religious feeling, in the orthodox sense, and that the Catholic Church was, to the Spanish people, at any rate in Catalonia and Aragon, a racket, pure and simple. He muses that Christianity may have, to some extent, been replaced by anarchism. The latter portion of the chapter briefly details various operations in which Orwell took part. Silently advancing the loyalist front line by night, for example. Chapter 6. One of these operations, which in Chapter 5 had been postponed, was a holding attack on Huesca. Designed to draw the nationalist troops away from an anarchist attack on the Jaca road. It is described herein. It is one of the most significant military actions that Orwell participates in during his entire time in Spain. Orwell notes the offensive of that night where his group of 15 captured a nationalist position, but then retreated to their lines with captured rifles and ammunition. However, despite these finds, Orwell and his group were forced to pull back before they could secure a large telescope they had discovered in a machine gun case. Something more badly needed to their side than any single weapon. However, the diversion was successful in drawing troops from the anarchist attack. The chapter ends with Orwell lamenting that even now he still is upset about losing the telescope. Chapter 7. This chapter reads like an interlude. Orwell shares his memories of the 115 days he spent on the war front, and its influence on his political ideas. The prevailing mental atmosphere was that of socialism. The ordinary class division of society had disappeared to an extent that is almost unthinkable in the money-tainted air of England. The effect was to make my desire to see socialism established much more actual than it had been before. By the time he left Spain, he had become a convinced democratic socialist. The chapter ends with Orwell's arrival in Barcelona on the afternoon of the 26th of April 1937. And after that the trouble began. Chapter 8. Orwell details noteworthy changes in the social and political atmosphere of Barcelona when he returns after 3 months at the front. He describes a lack of revolutionary atmosphere and the class division that he had thought would not reappear, i.e., with visible division between rich and poor and the return of servile language. Orwell had been determined to leave the POUM, and confesses here that he would have liked to join the anarchists, but instead sought a recommendation to join the international column, so that he could go to the Madrid front. The latter half of this chapter is devoted to describing the conflict between the anarchists and the Socialist Unión General de Trabajadores, UGT, and the resulting cancellation of the May Day demonstration and the build-up to the street fighting of the Barcelona May Days. It was the antagonism between those who wished the revolution to go forward and those who wished to check or prevent it, ultimately, between anarchists and communists. Chapter 9. Orwell relates his involvement in the Barcelona street fighting that began on the 3rd of May when the government assault guards tried to take the telephone exchange from the SNT workers who controlled it. For his part, Orwell acted as part of the POUM, guarding a POUM-controlled building. Although he realizes that he is fighting on the side of the working class. Orwell describes his dismay at coming back to Barcelona on leave from the front only to get mixed up in street fighting. Assault guards from Valencia arrive. All of them were armed with brand new rifles. Vastly better than the dreadful old blunderbusses we had at the front. The communist-controlled Unified Socialist Party of Catalonia newspapers declare POUM to be a disguised fascist organization. No one who was in Barcelona then will forget the horrible atmosphere produced by fear, suspicion, hatred. Censored newspapers, crammed jails, enormous food queues, and prowling gangs. In his second appendix to the book, Orwell discusses the political issues at stake in the May 1937 Barcelona fighting. As he saw them at the time and later on, looking back. Chapter 10. Here he begins with musings on how the Spanish Civil War might turn out. Orwell predicts that the tendency of the post-war government is bound to be fascistic. He returns to the front, where he is shot through the throat by a sniper, an injury that takes him out of the war. After spending some time in a hospital in Lleida, he was moved to Tarragona where his wound was finally examined more than a week after he'd left the front. Chapter 11. Orwell tells us of his various movements between hospitals in Sétimo, Barbastro, and Monzón. While getting his discharge papers stamped, after being declared medically unfit, he returns to Barcelona only to find that the POUM had been suppressed. It had been declared illegal the very day he had left to obtain discharge papers, and POUM members were being arrested without charge. The attack on Huesca was beginning. There must have been numbers of men who were killed without ever learning that the newspapers in the rear were calling them fascists. This kind of thing is a little difficult to forgive. He sleeps that night in the ruins of a church. He cannot go back to his hotel because of the danger of arrest. Chapter 12. This chapter describes his visits accompanied by his wife to George's COP. Unit commander of the ILP contingent while COP was held in a Spanish makeshift jail. Really the ground floor of a shop. Having done all he could to free COP. Ineffectively and at great personal risk, Orwell decides to leave Spain, crossing the Pyrenees frontier. He and his wife arrived in France without incident. End of the summary. Thank you.